As I said at the start, we are continuing our series in the call. We're week 3 into this new series. Exciting. And the background of this is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, where Paul says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received." So that's the heart. That's our beating heart. I want to be someone who's living my life in a way which is worthy of the calling God has for me and for each of us. You know, we've been looking at different aspects of our calling to follow Jesus, and today we're considering generosity. What does it mean for us to be generous as we follow Jesus? And we're in Mark's Gospel this morning, at the end of chapter 12. You can click on your phones, feel free to grab a copy of the Bible from the back if you like the feeling of physical papers. And also Eddie's going to be getting the verses up on the screen as well. So we're in Mark chapter 12, starting from verse 41. The widow's offering. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Wonderful. So that's our passage for this morning. I'm just going to move all here, rearrange here. Let's see. So, today's passage is all about what is of worth to Jesus. So, what is of worth to Jesus? And you might have heard this passage spoken about before in terms of sacrifice. You know, we need to sacrifice for God. But I see something different going on here. It's not so much about sacrifice, but about worth. These verses are all about worth. What is worth more to God? What matters to Jesus? You know, we see different sacrifices throughout the Bible, and not all were actually pleasing to God, even though they were sacrifices. Not all were as worth much. Not all were worth as much to God. First, there was Cain and Abel, who both offered sacrifices to God, yet Abel's was more pleasing to God because it was offered in faith. Then Abraham, when asked by God to offer up his only son Isaac as a sacrifice, said to his servants in Genesis chapter 22, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." And this is really interesting because that's the first time in the Bible the word worship is used. Genesis chapter 22. There have been lots of sacrifices, but this was the first time the word worship was used. And it wasn't referring to the sacrifice so much as the act of surrender to God, to bow down in obedience and surrender to Him. Then there's another occasion we read in the Old Testament when King Saul didn't follow through what God had asked him to do. And instead he tried to explain his actions in terms of sacrifice. "I've done this because it was a sacrifice for you, Lord." It wasn't what God had asked him. And Samuel the prophet came to him, and he did not mince his words. He said to King Saul, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice." That was what was of greater worth. And written later on in the Old Testament is a psalm by King David who understood this. And I actually shared this verse the other week. It's so good I'll share it again. Psalm 40 verse 5. Says, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened." See, there's something different going on here. To listen to God, to respond to what He was saying, was more important. over time, God's people, who were meant to be a blessing to the whole world, in fact started to be the exact opposite. And their ears and their hearts became closed to God. God started to describe them as having hard hearts and closed ears, when they were meant to be a blessing. Instead, they were found to be mistreating the poor, doing evil in God's eyes, and they were not being obedient to Him. Yet, here's the irony. They continue to gather for religious festivals and make these generous sacrifices. And so in Amos chapter 5, the prophet speaks God's word to God's people. He says, even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring me choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. God wasn't looking for the sacrifices they were offering Him. He was looking for generosity to the poor, a heart of justice, a heart that reflected His. Then here we are in Mark chapter 12, up to Stephen today. And Jesus contrasts this poor widow with others who had a far greater standing in society. They had a far greater position of authority, far greater worth in society as people. And they came across as generous, yet they missed the heart of God. They missed what was of greater worth. It wasn't about the sacrifice for them, it's about worth. Earlier in Mark chapter 12, the actions of this widow is contrasted with the actions of the teachers in the beginning, who wanted a generous treatment towards themselves. They wanted to be respected. They wanted people to speak well of them. They wanted to be well thought after. They wanted to be greeted in the marketplaces. They wanted people to see their acts of generosity. They wanted generous treatment towards themselves. Yet, they were doing wrong in their treatment of others. And they missed the true generosity and love which characterizes Jesus' kingdom. In a later historical Jewish text, it's actually really interesting, I found, that there was a poor woman who had to go through public ridicule because of a small gift in the offering. They ridiculed her for that. How different Jesus is in His kingdom. In this passage, He's uplifting a poor widow, and He's uplifting what she has done. He's saying that is a worth to God. You know, kingdom generosity isn't only about financial generosity, but about being a person that is generous in spirit, how that affects how we live, how we treat one another, how we do every area of our life. That is what is of worth to God. That is generosity. And so what's going on in this passage today? Well, does anyone like people watching here? Sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? People watching sounds a bit creepy. Doesn't it? But, I'm sure you all do it. But, if you're in a busy place, maybe you're sitting in a coffee shop and, you're watching people go past, and you're wondering, I wonder where they come from, or what's going on, or you see parents struggling with their young children, dragging them along. That's probably me, Abby and Esther Hudson, by the way, don't judge. People watching. This is what Jesus is doing in this passage. He is people watching. He's in the temple with His disciples, and He's just watching. He's hanging out, and He's observing what is going on. He was watching as people were putting their money into the offering. And for collecting the offering, there would have been a series of large brass trumpet-shaped collection containers. As coins were dropped in, the sound of metal on metal was heard. They would have made a loud, resounding noise. So imagine the noise as people went in with their flowing robes and threw handfuls of money into the offering, and the resound out through the temple. People think, wow, they are generous. Look and hear that noise. And people doing that again and again. imagine this poor widow comes on, slowly making her way to do what she needs to do. And the sound of 2 chains ahead, ding, ding, 2 small copper coins dropping. That's all. You know, the largest sums given by others would have been silver and gold coins. So a silver coin in that day was called a denarius, which was equivalent to about a day's wage for a labourer. Then there was a gold coin called an aureus, if I'm pronouncing that right, which was valued at about 25 silver denarii. So that's nearly a month's wage. Yet these 2 very small copper coins, each one would have been worth only about 1/128th of a silver denarius. So the 2 of them, that's about 1/64th, if my math is correct, for both. Her contribution was tiny in comparison to others. Yet Jesus sees something so important happening. He's observing, he's like, whoa, guys, two minutes. I've got something for you here. Come. Let me explain to you what is actually happening here. And Jesus starts by saying to his disciples, truly, I tell you. Now, whatever Jesus says is important, right? But when he says, truly, I tell you, he's saying, I'm about to deliver something of real significance. So you need to listen. Like when a parent uses a child's full name. Some people are so surprised by my full name. They don't realize it's Donald. My name is Donald Kenneth Thomas. And if my dad would ever say Donald, he certainly got my attention. In verse 43, Jesus goes on to say, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. Go figure. Son's like, did you hear the noise? Did you not hear the noise of what everyone else put in? Did you not hear the noise of what she put in? Go figure. Jesus says she put more into the treasury than all the others. In other words, of all the great sacrifices people were making, hers was of the greatest value to God. It was worth more in Jesus' eyes. Jesus recognized the greater worth of what she had done than all the others, and he wanted to take this moment to teach his disciples. I love that. I absolutely love that. Let's just pause for a moment on this story. In the Gospels, there are lots of people who call Jesus teacher. Of the approximate 90 times Jesus was addressed directly in the Gospel, around 60 of those he was called teacher. The word disciple literally means learn. It means learn. So Jesus' call to follow was one of learning from him. To be his disciple, to listen to him and be shaped by him. In John's Gospel, not long before his death on the cross, Jesus tells his disciples, John chapter 13, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. That's Jesus' heart of generosity. That we would have our feet first washed by him, be utterly changed by his love and kindness, and then go out and do likewise for others. So let's pause for a moment and consider ourselves. Me, all of us in this room. Are we willing to take Jesus as our teacher? Are we willing to have him speak into our lives, direct us, challenge us about our heart and generosity, just like he did for his disciples? Guys, I've seen something, come here. I've got something so great to share with you. Are you going to listen? Are we teaching? I remember at school, particularly primary school, sorry Kirsty, you're always listening to my teachers. I can't remember if I shared this story with you before, but I remember on one occasion, Our playground, our outside playground, was all kind of dipping, inclined towards a drain in the middle where all the water would drain away. But this drain on winter got blocked. And so throughout the week, it was a very, very wet week, and I saw a puddle form on our playground, just getting bigger and bigger. Gradually, our space to play was getting smaller and smaller until it would take up a huge proportion of our playground. But I had a plan. I was desperate to get in that puddle. I was absolutely desperate. I was pretty young at that age. I can't remember how old I was, but I was just desperate to get in that puddle. And I remember thinking, I shouldn't get in it during the school week because, I'm probably in trouble. But at the weekend, I can do whatever I want. So I waited and waited, and the puddle was getting bigger and bigger. It got to Friday. This is fantastic. Hoping that it wouldn't drain out the puddle. I said, yes! The bell went. I ran outside. I was like, this is the weekend. I threw off my school bag and I just ran through the puddle. That wasn't enough. I got into the puddle. I sat in the puddle. I lay down in the puddle. This is ridiculous, isn't it? And this is where it starts to get a bit hazy for me in my memory. But what I've been told is at this point, the head teacher comes out. Says, don't, Thomas, get out of that puddle in this instant. And apparently I said, no, it's the weekend. I can do what I want. And eventually I came out and I remember the next day, I remember my mum coming to the school and me having to get changed into spare school clothes. There's that one spare pair of school clothes that no one wanted to wear. And I remember the head teacher saying, this is the most disobedient child I've ever met. I think, oh dear, I'm really going to get in trouble here. But the question is, are we teachable when it comes to God's heart for generosity, for how we treat others, for our actions, for what we do, yes, with our money, but also what we do with our lives, for how much we give away, for how much we keep for ourselves, for what we see actually having great worth in life. Are we teaching? Are we willing to see God's perspective of what is of greatest worth and what isn't, and then respond to that? One thing I try to do at the end of each month, I don't always manage it, but I have something, I do something cool, which I've called Learning with the Lord. And what that involves is a journal, my calendar, and my Bible. And I look back over the previous month, I look at what meetings I've been in, I look at what I've been doing, who I've met, what conversations I've had. I look over everything through the lens of asking Jesus what his perspective is on what I'm doing. What can I learn? What is he teaching me? Where are the mistakes? What has gone well? What hasn't gone well? And I prayerfully ask the Lord to teach me and show me his way so that I can learn from him and with him. Because when we're teachable, we're reachable. When we're teachable, we're reachable. No matter how far we've strayed from God's ways, no matter how out of line our idea of being a generous person with God's view of generosity, if we're willing to learn from Jesus, be teachable, he can reach us, he can shape us, he can mold us. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 21, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. It's from this place of surrender, being willing to learn from Jesus, that we can see what he holds up as being of worth, and we can respond to that. This poor widow gave just a couple of copper coins, but it was her everything. How is this woman more generous than the others? How did she give more? Jesus tells us in verse 44, it's very simple. He said, They gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty, putting everything, all she had to live. They gave out their surplus, she gave out her essential. In the eyes of the world, this widow's offering was worth next to nothing, 2 copper coins. However, in Jesus' eyes, it was worth everything, because she held nothing back. It was an act of trust, it was an act of faith, it was an act of worship. And worship, true worship, is all about worship. It's about what we value, what is of worth to us. When we worship Jesus, what matters to him also becomes what matters to us. That's where the greatest worth is. Going back to that verse I read at the very start of the talk, Ephesians 4, verse 1, where Paul says, as a prisoner for the Lord, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. God's calling is all about God's worth. Finding out what is of worth to him and in his kingdom, and giving ourselves to those things. Will we be marked by God's heart of generosity? Will we be generous across the board, no matter what area of our life? Whether it is literally, quite literally as this passage is, the offering, whether it's our financial giving to church, whether it's what we do with our time, what we do with our resources, how we treat others, it all matters to Jesus. God's calling is about finding God's word and pursuing that, giving our life to that with all that we have. Will we open our homes and hearts to one another, serving one another, loving one another, welcoming the widow, being Jesus to one another and to those who are hurting around us? Now, this is God's heart of generosity. There's a wonderful verse, as I'm coming into land. There's a wonderful verse in the Psalms where Jesus says, in Psalm 68, verse 5, not Jesus, the psalmist says, verse 68, verse 5, he is a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows. That's what Jesus was doing. Is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing. That's a lot more than just the sound of change on the goal of the offering. That's God's heart of generosity. Jesus is our ultimate example of this. He's the most generous, the most loving. He paid the biggest sacrifice for us. And I love how in Hebrews chapter 12, it has a slant on this. For the joy set before him. Yes, Jesus sacrificed, but it was for the joy because of the worth. Because of the worth he sees in each of us. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. How wonderful. Our calling is all about what is of worth to Jesus. And in that, we don't lose heart. Because it was his joy, in his sacrifice, because of his worth, and the worth he actually sees in us, that he gave up his life. Let's take hold of this life that Jesus has for us. When we ask that question, God, what is of worth to you? How do you want me to spend my life? The true act of worship, of worship. What are the 2 coins, the 2 copper coins that God wants you to give in his kingdom? Whatever that might be. Doesn't matter what other people say. It doesn't matter if it doesn't look impressive. It doesn't matter. What matters is pure devotion to Jesus. Because he's worth it. And because he says you're worth it as well. In the kingdom, you are of worth. You are of value to him. So we can spend our lives on him. Why don't we stand together?